strong slate going, and our first presenter here is Steve Cox on banknote security. Should be an interesting thing. A little bit about Steve. Steve Cox has over 40 years experience in numismatics. He started collecting in 1967 when his father gave him a well-worn Japanese 1 yen note. From that point forward, his interest in numismatics has expanded to include all manner of U.S. and foreign currency and coins, from ancients up to modern issues. Steve is a life member of the ANA, congratulations, a director of the PNNA, thanks for that hard work, and a member of the Vancouver, BC chapter of the International Banknote Society. Be entertained. Thank you, Steve.
Thank you, Gene. Well, as Gene said, my name is Steve Cox, and I've had quite a few years of experience in this hobby. I started out with paper money, and it's always been a primary love of mine. I collect the coins, certainly, as he mentioned, but banknotes have always held a special fascination for me. And this morning our talk is on banknote security, so we're going to go ahead and go right into the slides. Okay. Banknote security has been a hot topic in numismatics in recent years. Over the next hour, I'm going to try to display as many different types of the ways that banknotes have been made secure over the years. Recently, because of developments in technology, there have been a lot of changes in what constitutes a security feature for a banknote. And we'll be talking about some of those new features that are just coming out, but we'll also be looking back at some of the older techniques that have been used to keep paper money secure and safe from the counterfeiters. And over the course of this morning's talk, I'd like you to keep in mind the 4 rules of banknote security. These are the rules that security printers need to play by to produce a successful product. First, the product needs to be recognizable. The currency that they produce needs to be recognizable and acceptable to the people that it's intended for. Yeah, obviously, it needs to be inimitable. It's no good if a banknote is easily copied. That's the primary focus of today's discussion. Third, it needs to be durable. The most sophisticated banknote in the world, the most difficult...
That's the building PA system that's been down. Yeah, they didn't get it fixed yet, did they? Someone must have found the right switch. We'll get on to that.
Okay. Can you guys still hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay, all right. So third, it needs to be durable. It's no good if a note wears out in circulation too fast. And the fourth point, the fourth rule is economy. Banknotes are produced on a massive scale, and they need to be cost effective to produce and place into circulation. So I've arranged this talk on what I've described as elements of a secure banknote. We'll be talking briefly about printing methods. And you can think of these things, the elements, as tools that security printers have in their toolbox to make a successful product. Special inks, different designs that are specifically created to make notes harder to reproduce. The composition of the note itself, what it's made of. We'll discuss security threads and adhesives, seals, signatures, serial numbers, and then if we have time at the end, we'll briefly review polymer notes. So we have a lot to cover here in just a very brief time, so I'll be moving on at a fairly good clip here. First thing we'll discuss is printing methods, and just briefly I'd like to review 3 basic printing methods that are commonly used: intaglio, offset printing, and letterpress. We'll start with letterpress. It's one of the oldest printing methods. We see that on many of the notes of the 18th century and early 19th century. Here's an example from Pennsylvania, a 40 shillings note from 1775. Letterpress or typography involves setting type in a tray, which is then inked and placed in contact with the paper. It's the model of simplicity. The way that banknote security security printers have managed to make typography more secure is by using specific specialized fonts. And here on this early 19th century Russian note, we can see some of these special fonts that were employed. The sum block here with negative printing of the denomination. This is Russian for 10, Dechet. The serial numbers, which are in this outline font. These are fonts that wouldn't be widely available. So if someone did manage to get a hold of a printing press, they would have difficulty reproducing this note with the commonly available means at the time. Here's a later example of specialized fonts on this German Notgeld from the early 20s. Now, these days we don't see letterpress printing used very often in banknote production, except for certain features like these overprints. These were issued in the 1960s on these French colonial notes when France changed from the old franc to the new franc and they revalued their currency. And of course, we'll see it on serial numbers. Now, one feature of typography or letterpress that is always present is embossing. Because of the process of pushing the type into the paper, we'll see a embossed image, mirror image of the letters or numbers on the back of the note, particularly in a note that's high grade. Certainly with circulation, that embossing will flatten out. The next method of printing we'll briefly review is offset printing, offset lithography. This is a little bit more complex process where a design is created on a plate. The plate is then inked. The design is transferred to a roller, which is then transferred to paper, transfers the image to the paper. The French were big on this method of printing and used it in the early 20th century to create some really beautiful notes. The nice thing about offset printing is that it allows increased use of different colors and multiple color impressions. The French would run notes through the press multiple times using different colors. Here we have yellow and rose, and then we'll run it again with some pale blue and some dark blue to create what's really a masterpiece of banknote design. And notes like this circulated for many decades in France and were fairly safe from counterfeits. Rather difficult to reproduce. Here's just some examples from various French notes over the years. Very typical style, very colorful and pictorial, which is something that is allowed by the lithographic process. One thing you'll notice on all these impressions is the typical flatness. There's no embossing. Offset printed notes are very, very flat. The ink lies close to the surface of the page. The Russians also used offset printing to create some very beautiful notes and security paper. This is a Russian bond from the 1890s, which I think is particularly attractive with this rainbow-colored underprint. Here's a Russian note from the end of the 19th century, which employs a little bit more sophisticated version of offset printing. This is called the Orloff method. This involved inking multiple rollers in different colors, and the note was printed multicolor essentially simultaneously. And this invention, which was developed by Ivan Orloff in the 1890s, allowed for exact registry. You can see the interplay here between the rose color and the green and the way they have the shading here with the rose on the blue. The registry is absolutely precise, and any deviation would be fairly apparent. This was really difficult to copy prior to the development of the color photocopier and desktop scanners. If we flip this note over, we can take a look at the third type of printing we'll discuss, and that's intaglio printing. Intaglio printing is pretty easy to understand, but it's actually fairly difficult to reproduce, so it's an effective security device. In intaglio printing, a design is etched or carved into a plate. The plate is then inked. The ink is wiped off, leaving just the ink in the crevices. And then paper is applied under high pressure. And then as the paper lifts off the plate, the ink adheres to the paper and it forms these little ridges. And this gives intaglio printing its very unique, distinctive texture. And of course, intaglio printing is what we find on our own Federal Reserve notes. So the roughness that you feel on any US currency is due to the intaglio process. The Russians were masters, I think, at intaglio printing, and they produced some gorgeous notes in the early 20th century, which relied primarily on this process as a security feature. And throughout the 19th and 20th centuries, intaglio has been a major design feature in banknotes worldwide, even up into the modern era. And certainly here in North America, it's been a primary feature of our currency. If you have any confusion about telling the difference between intaglio and offset printing, just take a look at your notes, and I think it'll become clear. This is a great example from the West African states. The top note was produced in the 1960s, and it has intaglio printed main vignettes. And you can see the ridges of ink here on this close-up view quite clearly. Very distinct ridges, and that's going to feel rough to the touch. If we look at the bottom note, we can see that it's very flat and muddy. And you know, if one didn't know better, one might almost think this might be a counterfeit. But it's not. It's a genuine note that was produced in the 1970s after the value of 500 francs in West Africa had deteriorated to the point where they didn't feel it was important to use this security device anymore. Currently, intaglio and offset and letterpress printing are usually used in combination on most notes. This is a current note from the Faroe Islands, and it's a good example. We have offset printed colored background here. We have a beautiful intaglio vignette of the crab and the claw, and then we have letterpress to put the serial number on the note. Now let's talk a little bit about special inks. A lot of times, particularly in modern currency, very sophisticated inks are used to create specific effects on banknotes. In the early days, though, sometimes just having a color ink was enough. Here we have a couple of colonial notes again, and we can see the black on white printing, which was generally the rule of the time. This New Jersey note, though, from the 1770s, employs color. Color ink was a little bit harder to handle. It was often fairly volatile. It typically reacted with paper in negative ways. And so it was just a little bit more difficult to use, and was actually a fairly decent security feature for the time. But in general, through the 19th century, at least the first half, black on white was the rule, particularly here in North America. Now, the invention of photography at the end of the 1830s changed this. And by the 1850s, when photography had become more commercially available, we started seeing dangerous counterfeits of notes that were created using photographic media. This is a genuine note from the Bank of France, but it's just an example of the type of note that was typically circulating at the time. Nice black on white underprint, no color at all. The Bank of France was a leader in tackling the problem of graphic reproduction. And they introduced in the 1860s this pale blue ink, which they found to be very non-photogenic. And this note's from the 1870s, but it shows you what this type of currency looked like. This apparently was a fairly successful move for the bank because it continued to use this color of ink on its notes later on in combination with other colors. up through the 1930s and even 1940 on some series, some of the higher denomination notes. Here in North America, we see more continuation of the black on white. However, color overprints start appearing, as on this Boston note from the 1850s, and these more elaborately colored notes from Omaha, same time period. Color really became commonly used towards the end of the 19th century on world notes, and certainly continues to be used today, although we could hardly call it a security feature in modern terms. Given the technology that's available to everyone, color is just decorative now, not so much providing any sort of anti-counterfeit defense. But sometimes inks are chosen not for their color, but for specific optical properties. This is a good example from the Civil War. It has this translucent metallic overprint on this 10-cent fractional. Metallic inks are created so that they have a crystalline structure, and you can actually see some of the little flecks in this somewhat blurred close-up view. But this would have been rather difficult for someone to reproduce, certainly in the 1860s, and it provided a great deal of security for these notes. Problem was durability. And if we look at a well-circulated example of the same note, we can see that these tended to oxidize, and when they oxidize, they turn this dark, nasty green. They start flecking off, particularly where the note has been folded, and when they start doing that, they often will leave tears and holes in the note. So it really accelerated the wear around this area where the overprint was put. Not so great. Current metallic overprints hopefully are a little bit more durable, and they're usually created so that they have specific properties, often color changing, like is seen on the $100 note, where the green turns to this kind of dark grayish violet if the note is held tipped on edge. Here's a more colorful example from the Bank of Kazakhstan. This is a new note. It has this metallic color overprint, which changes to blue, from green to blue, when the note is held on edge. Kind of a neat feature. Sometimes colors are chosen because of their metameric effect. Metameric refers to changing visibility when something is filtered differently. And I think any of you who are old enough to remember the password game where you slip the card with the password in the little folder, and the red filter filters out the interference from the overprint here so that you can read the password, which previously wasn't legible. It's the same type of effect, and here we have a Dutch note from the 1980s that sort of uses a backwards version of this. In this green quadrangle here, we can kind of make out some features, but it's all fairly uniform in color. Depends on the lighting. But if you filter it with a red filter, you can see very clearly the image of a rabbit that stands out just by the colors that they chose. And any variance in the metameric effect of placing a red filter would indicate that maybe the note wasn't genuine. Hidden images also appear by use of ultraviolet sensitive inks. Here we have a really strong example from the Central Bank of Ireland, 50 pounds. It's really an elaborate ultraviolet device. And I think this one's kind of cute with a swordfish from the Seychelles Monetary Authority. I want to talk a little bit about design now and how design elements are used on currency to create increased counterfeit resistance. We'll talk about latent images and a little bit about microprinting, registry printing, screens. But first I want to mention the good old venerable guilloche, which has been around forever. This is an older example from the 1820s. A guilloche is simply a design that's created with all these fine curly-Q lines that interweave, and the whole structure is designed to be difficult to engrave, first of all, but very difficult for someone to copy. And you can imagine that you'd have to be a fairly skilled engraver to be able to reproduce this precisely. And certainly if you were going to try to create a copy of this note by hand, just by using pen and ink, which might be a method used back in the early 19th century, I mean, this would really be a bear to have to copy. You would not want to have to do that. Here's a few examples of guilloche on currency. This is from the Bank of Old Town in Maine. Here we have a later note from the U.S., a Treasury 5. Nice guilloche here on the back, and there's smaller ones everywhere all over the note. I think the guilloche really came onto its own in the 1920s. The Dutch were masters at designing currency basically around the guilloche, and this is a great example of some of their work. Very avant-garde for 1930, I think. Another printed security feature is the nature print. This was supposedly invented by Benjamin Franklin. I honestly don't know if that's true. I mean, a lot of things have been attributed to Benjamin Franklin, but he certainly did use this device. This note was printed by Franklin and Hall in Philadelphia in the mid-18th century. It employs leaves and other flora which were used to make a master impression, which then was transferred to the remaining notes of the series. I think the idea behind this device was that nature was so intricate and difficult to reproduce that no one would really be able to easily copy this device. So it kind of was like a natural guilloche for them. Security screens are commonly seen on banknotes. Here's a rather early example. This screening on the Russian denomination for this note. This is 5, and this fine screen would have been very difficult to reproduce. Here's a much more sophisticated version on a turn-of-the-century legal tender 20. The screening here behind Alexander Hamilton's portrait isn't just pretty, it's made up these very, very fine horizontal and diagonal lines, which would have been very difficult to copy. Here's another different type of example with these beautiful draped waves on this overprint for the Union Bank, which issued notes in New York in the early 19th century. This one's dated 1812. And if we go forward 150 years, we see the same type of thing going on this Australian 10 from the 1960s. Now, with the development of the color copier, banknote producers found that they had some challenges. And so security screens got a little bit more sophisticated. The screens on this 1990s Swedish note, I'll enlarge them here, are actually these, not concentric circles, they're actually spirals. And when these were copied, they tended to create moire interference patterns, which would look somewhat like this, where these fins would start appearing out the edge. I had difficulty reproducing this effect because I didn't have access to 1990s technology. And current scanners and printers, desktop printers, don't have any trouble reproducing this type of device at all. So banknote security printers have had to up their game, and one of the ways they've done that is the introduction of these little devices called Omron rings. These appear on the back of the Canadian 100, and actually all the Canadian banknotes have these Omron rings somewhere, and many other banknote producers are using it. The Federal Reserve uses a version of this system. But the arrangement of these rings somehow interferes with a printer's ability to print the note. So I can scan this note, I can image it here without any difficulty, but if I tried to print this out on my desktop printer, this is what happens. It starts printing and then it stops about a third of the way through, and then it prints out this website address. And if I go to that website, it takes me to the Banknotes and Counterfeit Deterrence group, which allows me to look up various rules and regulations on why I can't copy and print that note. So it's kind of an interesting feature. Registry printing, as I mentioned, is another fairly early security device. The French love to use registry printing. Here on the 1790s assignat, we see Winged Victory here on the upper left corner, and then on the back upper right corner, the same vignette in mirror image, so that when you hold the note to the light, these are printed in exact registry. That's a somewhat difficult feature to reproduce. And the early notes of the Bank of France, as seen here on this 1852 100-franc note, really relied on this security device. The entire note was printed in exact registry, in mirror image on the back. This isn't simply offset. This is, this is truly a printed security device. And the registry on this is absolutely perfect. And it was easy to tell because the paper that they used on these notes was so incredibly thin, you'd be able to see any difference in registry quite easily. Here's a more modern version on this Dutch note, just a small security device here in the corner. This is on the front, this is on the back, and if we look at the two together by holding the note up to a light, the composite image, in this case of a tulip bulb, appears. Microprinting, I mentioned, is another common security device. We see it here in the US on our currency, and here on the Bank of Canada note, you can see some very fine microprinting. This is a neat example, though. This is a really early microprinting. This note is from Russia, obviously. It's from 1857. The back of the note has a very simple design, which is primarily made up of the redemption and anti-counterfeiting clauses. And each clause is printed in 3 different fonts: normal, italic, and micro. And this might not be considered micro these days, but it's pretty micro for 1857. So this was a very early attempt at that security device. Microperforation, while we're on micro, this is a much rarer security feature. I'm not sure how many banks are using this. I know that the National Bank of Switzerland uses it on their higher denomination notes. And just in this area is microperforated a 50. And in this enlargement, you can barely make out the edges of the 50, but it's still almost impossible to see until you backlight the note, and then the light passes through these tiny, tiny little holes. A very difficult feature for someone to try to copy. And lastly, for printed security devices, latent images. Latent images are commonly seen on modern notes, and this is a good example from Tunisia. You see this small device here in the lower right-hand corner of the note. It's made up of vertical lines, which create this nice little ornament design, and some horizontal lines you see in here, which if you trace it around, you'll see that it makes out the image of a 5. So depending on which angle you hold the note and at what angle the light is coming from, you might see the 5 more clearly or the ornament more clearly. And you can kind of tip the note back and forth and make one disappear and the other appear alternately. Very difficult effect to reproduce because it relies on these raised ridges of ink, which you're not going to get if you just try to make a copy of this or scan it and print it on your desktop printer. I'm going to pass around a board here, and this just has a bunch of currency tacked onto it, which I want you to feel the feel. It's all about touch here right now. who couldn't tell the difference between a Federal Reserve note and just a piece of ordinary writing paper by touching it alone? It has a very distinctive feel. And all currencies issued over the centuries for different regions have had very distinctive feels. Here's a couple of extreme examples. This tissue-thin, very fine paper for this French assignat from the 1790s. And compare that to, if anyone here is familiar with the Hansatsu, the locally printed notes for Japan in the 18th and 19th centuries. These notes were printed on laminated paper that was almost like a thin cardboard, and rather coarse too. And the introduction of polymer has really challenged people's idea about how paper money should feel. I'm going to pass around a couple of versions, a paper $5 note from New Zealand and a polymer $5 note. Feel free to just close your eyes and feel them and see if you can tell the difference. I'm sure you can. There's a very distinctive feel to polymer. Beyond the feel of the note, banknote security printers can change the appearance of the paper, and this is often done by tinting. These early Russian notes are great examples. This 1811 5 ruble has this really deep dark blue tint, which is very distinctive. And you compare that to the next higher denomination, the 10, which is printed on kind of a dull rose paper. And they're often faded out, and this is certainly no exception. But the difference in color would have made these notes very, very easy to distinguish. You may also notice here the difference in printing orientation. We have the horizontal printing on the 5 and the diagonal printing on the 10. A further attempt at security device, because someone trying to take a 5 and pass it off as a 10 by changing the denomination would have a rough time, because first of all the printing wouldn't be running the right way, and then the color would be completely wrong. Interesting to note, the higher denominations of these early Russian notes are all printed on white paper. So I think the assumption was that the higher denominated notes would rely a little bit more on printed security devices, and they were more text-oriented because the people supposedly handling them would have been perhaps more literate. I'm not sure. The Bank of Cadiz in Spain in the 1860s issued similarly tinted notes to distinguish different denominations, one from the other. Now here in North America, the use of tinted paper has been much, much less prevalent. Generally, the rule has been white paper for our notes, as seen here. This is an unusual obsolete from Massachusetts from the 1820s, printed on a rose-tinted paper, which is rather exceptional. And of course, I think we're all familiar with the California gold banknotes that were issued in the 1870s, printed on this gold-tinted paper, and you can easily distinguish that from a banknote from the same bank after the gold banknote privilege had expired. But these, oh here we have one more kind of anomalous note. The $20 continental currency note. This is another Ben Franklin story. Supposedly Franklin purchased the paper for this note in France, and it's reasonable to assume that was the case because actually marbling was a little bit of a rare technology, at least in North America during the 1770s. So this hand-applied marble edge would have been a fairly effective security feature. But apart from these anomalies, really we didn't use a lot of tinted paper until the 1870s, or the end of the 1860s. This is a nice 1875 series $2 Lazy 2. This note, unfortunately, is not in my collection. I sure wish it was. I don't have a good example of a U.S. note that has this feature, so I borrowed this from Heritage. Anyway, you can see the blue tint running through part of the paper here. A little bit more affordable are the notes from Germany from the 1920s, which employ the same type of feature. And this not only provided a little bit of security for the banknote, but also helped people distinguish various denominations, particularly during this period in the early 20s when they were having to issue increasingly higher and higher denominations of banknotes, and it got rather confusing. Here's another example, 500,000 marks, nice violet tint. Here we can see watermarking, and this is the next feature I wanted to mention. Watermarking is another very old technique that has been used to secure banknote paper. Here's a really bold example. This is one of my favorite watermarks from the Netherlands. This note from the 1940s has this great cubic pattern. I just love this watermark. I think it's really, really neat. Sometimes watermarks can be surprisingly sophisticated. These Russian notes from the 1840s had a really neat feature. If we backlight them, we see the date. So each note was dated here, 1841, 1842. And in addition to getting the date right, the counterfeiter would have had to go to the bother of creating the watermark to match the correct date of the note. It just made it a little bit more difficult for someone to copy. The Japanese, I think, were probably the most skilled at applying watermarks to their paper, and this is just a beautiful example from an early 20th century 1 yen note. You notice the shading here that they were able to achieve by varying the thickness of the paper. The dark areas of the watermark are where the paper is thicker, the light areas are where the paper is relatively thinner. And it's just amazing that they were able to create these. Certainly level of care I don't see in any series of banknote today. But watermarks certainly are still used. They're very difficult for people to reproduce and relatively economical to create in large quantity. I'd like to leave the watermark topic with one last example. This is a very nice note from Algeria from the 1890s, printed in France, and you can see this really elaborate shaded watermark of the lion. It's kind of hard to make out because the design here is so busy and the paper of the note is so thin, but hopefully you can see that. And certainly you can read the name of the bank and the denomination of the note here. Now we have another example. This note doesn't really look too bad. It's a counterfeit. You can see some funky things around the serial number here. The printing looks pretty good, but the watermark is apparently was beyond the skill of the person who tried to pass this note. So what they did was emboss the note with the image of the watermark, and you can see where the paper's been cut a little bit around the edge. It's a very interesting attempt to fake a watermark. Embossing certainly has been used legitimately as a banknote security feature here on a German note from the 1920s, which has this very elegant embossed pattern, pretty much covering about 20% of the note's surface here on the right edge. And the Netherlands Bank used embossing on many of their notes prior to the introduction of the euro. You can see these raised lumps here in the paper on the 100 gulden. And compare that to the 10 gulden denomination from the same series, which has this herringbone pattern. So not only would the embossing be something that would be difficult to reproduce, but also it enabled people that were visually impaired to more easily identify the notes just by touch. Kind of in a category all their own are what I call inclusions. These are things that are mixed into the paper mix, into the pulp prior to producing the paper. This is a very early example of an inclusion. It's a little mica chip. These actually occur all over the surface of this note, and they create a very typical flash when the notes tip back and forth in the light. a very special paper that would have been reserved for this issue of notes, not widely available. Similarly, we have the security threads embedded in the U.S. currency. Here we see it on a turn-of-the-century gold certificate, a close-up view. This is a very odd example of security threads. I'm not sure anyone else has used this feature. This is a German note from the 20s, and it has the security threads all bunched up in these little columns. So it creates the appearance of striped paper at first glance, but it's just the threads in the paper arranged in those rows. It's very odd. Security threads are still relied on today. Often they'll fluoresce under UV light, so they may not really be visible at all on a note surface, but when you put it under UV light, you get this flash of color. In addition to security threads, we have security planchets. These are just little colored discs of paper that have been embedded in the pulp. Here we see them on Bank of Canada 20s. And here's a nice example. This is a proof of the underprint for the Canadian Bank of Commerce $50 note. And it's printed on this planchet security paper. If we zoom in a bit on the paper, we can see the individual planchets. You'll notice the variance in intensity depending on whether the planchet's lying close to the surface of the paper or deeper into the paper. These iridescent planchets are another type of security feature which is often used. There's a problem with this though. These scales, which are very flashy and they lie on the surface of the note, usually in a band, here they are on this note, they tend to fleck off, and as these notes get worn, these things tear off quite easily and they leave a thin spot in the paper, if not a downright hole, and they really impair the wear on notes with this type of device. Similar problems were encountered by the firm that employed this security device, these confetti strips of paper which are distributed over part of the note surface. Very attractive, kind of neat, but they tear off really easy. And when they tear off, they leave a big gash in the note, and the next thing you know, the paper money's worn down to a rag. So not so economical. Security threads and adhesives are an important topic, and I'm going to just run through some examples here. Security thread technology was introduced in the United States in the 1870s, and we see it here on this very well-worn $20 silver certificate, and on this Portland National from the 1880s. You can see these threads running horizontally through the length of the note. There's a blue one on the top, a red one on the bottom, same story here. Take a closer look and we can see the red fiber sticking out through the paper. The Bank of Spain really kind of upped us on this one. They weren't satisfied just with the security thread, and during the same time period they created this security mesh which was embedded in the paper of their notes. I think this was a durability problem though. They didn't use this feature for very long, and obviously it must have been fairly expensive to create. Security thread technology really didn't change a whole lot until 1940, and that was the year that the Bank of England introduced the metallic security thread, which is virtually invisible on front, but looking at the note backlit, we see the security thread running through the note quite clearly. And here's another version of the metallic security thread. This has a very nice scalloped edge to it. Bank of England led the way again in 1984 with the introduction of what was known as Stardust. This is Stardust. It's a windowed security thread which passes through the note, weaves in and out of the paper, so it appears intermittently at the surface. Very difficult to reproduce. And this was successfully exported to notes worldwide, and it's seen all over the place now in one form or another. This is another Kazakhstan note. We see a windowed security thread similar to on the British note. The difference with this is it has demetallized areas in the thread which have text, and that becomes visible when we backlight the note, and we can read the denomination. Now, the reason I lump security threads and adhesives together is because often security threads, or what appears to be a security thread, is simply just an adhesive. Here we have a intermittent metallic finish thread, if you will, or strip, just affixed to the surface of the note. This is a genuine note. It's a genuine security feature, very economical to produce, obviously, much cheaper than stardust, but still effective against photocopying or other simple means of reproduction. These types of features have been used worldwide, and sometimes they're not even strips. This is an adhesive that's just kind of this ovoid. The Euro series employs these security devices that are known as kinograms. And this is a very dynamic optical variable device which, when the note is tipped back and forth, the letters and numbers appear to rush in and rush out. It's a very difficult effect for me to demonstrate here. At the end of the session, I have a Canadian $5 note I can show you, which it has a similar type device. And here are the Canadian notes, which just recently introduced this kinogram strip over the past few years. Here we see a close-up. On this, in this case, the colors not only change as you tip the note back and forth, but these fives appear to shift back and forth, and the borders around the larger fives, and here the tens, appear to expand and contract. Sometimes security threads and strips aren't particularly obvious, as in the case of our Federal Reserve notes, but we do have them. They're embedded in the paper. They're fairly transparent, but they fluoresce under UV light, different colors, and you can see that each one's in different position depending on the denomination of the note. One of the latest devices to come out is called Verify. This note is from Bulgaria, and it debuted this new security feature in 2005. It's this strip here, which is affixed to the surface of the note. It's a polymer strip on a paper note. You can see there's a little window here cut in the paper, and you can see the back side of the polymer strip visible. If we take a closer look at Verify, we can see that it has various design elements. Here we have 20s distributed across the note. This is visible when the note is backlit or against a white background. When we put the note against a black background, these green stripes become apparent. That's kind of an interesting security feature. And direct competition is optics. This is another device that was introduced, this in 2006. This is a metallic security strip which runs across the face of the note. And if we backlight the note, we can see that it's been demetallized. In other words, the metallic area has been removed in certain areas so that we can see these stylized reindeer and various text and denomination. And then if we look at the back of the note, we can see what's going on here. We have this weird deckled oval window where we can see the strip coming through. So it's a very unusual security device, and only time will tell how successful these are, as they're quite new. Before you get the idea, though, that security devices like this, the high-tech application and creative thinking in banknote security is something new, let's take a look at an old note. This is one of my favorites. This is a note from Japan from the 1860s. And it employs a very high-tech security device in the form of a photograph that's been affixed to the note. So this is sort of the kinogram adhesive of the 1860s. And certainly this wouldn't have been a widely available technology in Japan at the time, so it provided quite a degree of security for this note. Lastly, we'll talk about the motion security strip. This was introduced in 2006, I believe, on the Swedish 1,000 kroner note. Here we see the note. If we look at the strip a little more carefully, we can see that there's images and numbers on it, and if you were to hold this note in your hand, the strip has a 3D effect that almost makes it look like these numbers and symbols are riding about an inch below the plane of the note. So it's a very distinctive security feature that you can't miss. The Bank of Mexico introduced it on their higher denomination notes just last year. Supposedly the Federal Reserve is going to be utilizing it on the new version of the $100 bill. The Bureau of Engraving and Printing has not set a time frame for that, though. We're kind of running short on time, unfortunately, so I'm going to blow through seals, signatures, and serial numbers pretty quick. Seals have appeared on banknotes for centuries, often just as an ornamental feature, but sometimes as much more. This Japanese national banknote from the 1870s has a very interesting feature, a seal that's imprinted on the back of the note. This is a first series national. They also made second series. This is another example. So this was applied in such a way that half the seal remained on the note and half on a page that was left at the bank. And here's one of those pages. So if a note was brought in to the bank for redemption and there was some question about its authenticity, we could take that note and, based on its serial number, match it up to the exact position where it was supposed to be on the page to verify if the seals match. Now clearly here they don't. This page actually comes from an entirely different bank, but you get the idea of how this system might have worked. Signatures appear on banknotes as well as sort of a low-level security device. But sometimes they are combined with numbers. Here the cashier has signed the note and put a number indicating which block the note came out of, which is going to relate somehow to this serial number. Serial numbers themselves can provide a level of security. If there's a code, the Bank of France for itself and colonies have used coded serial numbers for many years. Serial number appears in two places, an ordinal number and then a coded number. This indicates that this note is from the first block of 1,000 notes, and it's note 989. So this overall is the 989th note numbered of this series. As we move up the alphabet, we get higher and higher notes. This X1, 00, X refers to the 22nd letter of the alphabet, so we have note 22,000. And so on. Here the D doesn't refer to a 4 anymore, it refers to a 29 because we got a second series here. So we're in the 29th block, note 28239. Now, if that seems a little complicated, it's not compared to the Bank of England's serial number. This had a very elaborate code which was related to the denomination, the branch of issue, the date of printing, and a coded number that was embedded in the watermark. So much harder code to crack. Sometimes the serial numbers themselves can have some degree of security embedded in them. Here we have gradated fonts on this Kazakhstan note, making it just a little harder to copy. This is an entirely new feature. Here we see the same type of deal in the late 19th century. Not different sizes, but slightly different fonts, as can be seen with these twos that are superimposed one over the other. And the Dutch use the same system. Two serial numbers on the back, each employing a different font for each digit. I guess the hope was that a counterfeiter wouldn't notice this and just use one font, making the counterfeits easier to identify. So in the last couple minutes, I just want to talk real quickly about polymers. Polymer was introduced in 1988 with this commemorative Australian note. These were rather expensive to produce. They really didn't go heavily into circulation, but it was an interesting experiment which proved to be quite successful for Australia and New Zealand at least. A polymer has some interesting features. First of all, it's very durable. Secondly, it allows the incorporation of fairly sophisticated optical variable devices like this portrait of Captain Cook, which appears to change color, and this sort of wheel flashes around as you tip the note in different lights. So currently, Australia and New Zealand produce notes in polymer exclusively. Take a closer look here at this note from New Zealand. You can see one typical feature of polymer, a clear window which appears in most polymer notes. If we backlight this note, we can see some embossing in that window, which is another typical feature, and also a faux watermark. It's not a watermark, it's not paper. It's somehow incorporated in the plastic so that it doesn't appear until the note is backlit. And this is the last note we'll discuss today. This is a 2000 lei from Romania. This was issued in 1999, I believe. Here we see the clear window, as we saw previously. The reason it appears black is I scanned this note against a dark background. And if we take a closer look at that, we see this little rough patch. If we shine a laser through that, it's going to project an image. This is using technology called transmission hologram, and I don't understand how this works myself, but it's quite an unusual security feature. And with that, we're going to close. There's a couple of references here that I recommend. The Moneymakers International, which was published in the 1980s, has some great images of how banknotes have been made secure over the years. And Optical Document Security, which is rather technical, but it has some really interesting information about how some of these sophisticated security features really work. All right. Well, thank you very much for your attention.